Everyone. It is 1 o'clock, so we'll start on time to keep us on track and to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. For those of you that don't know, I've met most of you in this room. My name's Austin Doctor. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at UNO and also a researcher affiliated with NCITE. I'm just really excited about today's event. We get to welcome soon to be Dr. Devorah Margolin to talk about a really important subject within the broader field of security studies, and that is the role of women and the dynamics of gender in violent extremism. Dev is here this week joining us at NCITE as a member of the program on extremism at George Washington University. I'm going to let Claire give Dev's formal introduction in a moment, but she's here to support as a strategic partner in a DHS-funded grant relating to the reintegration of the spouses and children, the families of foreign terrorist fighters here in the U.S. And so really excited about this opportunity to work together. This is one of my favorite parts about being connected to the NCITE community, is just the chance to work with people who are both brilliant and kind. And the world is filled with people who are one of those things. It's hard to find both. And the NCITE community, I think, has done that really well. And so Dev is no exception to that. So looking forward to our discussion today. I'm not going to hog the mic because I'm also here to learn. But let me hand the mic over to Claire, who's our project RA and an undergraduate here at UNO. I'll let her provide a formal introduction for Dev, and then we'll all sit back and learn about women and violent extremism. Claire.
Devorah Margolin's research focuses on the role of propaganda, the countering of violent extremism, women and violent extremism, and terrorism financing and governance. She's the Director of Strategic Initiatives and a Senior Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University. Dev is also a Senior Researcher here at NCITE and holds the title of Co-Principal Investigator on the George Washington University of Nebraska Omaha grant for DHS, examining best practices for reintegration programming for returning spouses and minors. She's the project manager of the ISIS Files project and serves as a contributor for the BBC and provides commentary for the New York Times, the Telegraph, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Times. Her work has been published in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, the CTC Centennial, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, Terrorism and Political Violence, and numerous other peer-reviewed articles in newspapers, many of which have been presented to government officials, academics, and practitioners across the globe. We are so excited to have her here with us today. Please welcome Devorah Margolin.
Thank you for having me here today. A little more about my background and about myself is I've come, like Austin said, I'm not yet Dr. Margolin. I've kind of taken a non-traditional background. I did an undergraduate degree, worked for a few years in the field, then did a master's degree, and then worked for another 10 years before pursuing a PhD, which I have now done mostly part-time while working full-time. So it's a bit of a non-traditional path. And if anyone's interested in that in general, I'm happy to discuss why I took that path. And I also think it's really important to talk about that path for different financial reasons or decisions that affect us, such as life and family. So always happy to talk about that in a question and answer as we go forward. So I'm here today to talk to you about my work on women and violent extremism. And I've had the opportunity due to this talk and a few other talks that I'm giving in the next week that I've thought about this a little bit more. And I've been doing research now for over 15 years, which is mind-boggling to me, because I know I don't look that old. But it's something I have been working on and kind of asking this question. And I had a wonderful opportunity to speak with Claire this morning. And I was talking about, there's always for us researchers a question that drives what we do. And for me, when I started out 15 years ago, one, I was the only woman in the office. And two, a lot of the research that we were doing was talking about terrorism or terrorists, but there wasn't a lot of description about who these individuals were or why. And there was a lot of questions I had. The first one was, where are the women? We know that women are taking part. Why are we not disaggregating this? Why are we not talking about this more? Is everything really just gender neutral? And in my class, I usually begin the semester by talking about and asking my students, how often do you think about gender? And I asked the students to raise their hands, and I won't do this to you today, but I will tell you that I've now taught this for several semesters. And when I ask this question, I ask the students, and they say, all the female students say, I think about gender on a daily basis. The male students don't always say that. Some of them do, but most of them don't. And when I ask my male students, when do you think about gender? They say when they walk into a room and it's predominantly female and they're the minority. Whereas as a woman, I think about gender when I get dressed in the morning, when I'm walking down the street, and every room that I enter. And I think that's an important part of the discussion is when we think about this, what does this mean for our dynamics? And hopefully I'll talk a little bit today and add some clarification on why that's important for us in our research. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some background, some definitions, what is this? And then I'm going to talk to you about some of my current projects, which show a diverse aspect of how we can use these lenses to discuss gender and women within violent extremism. So first things first, I think it's really important to acknowledge what we talk about when we talk about violent extremism. And it really depends on the current events. When we talk about violent extremism here in the United States, there's plenty of questions in its own lecture in and of itself. What is violent extremism? What is terrorism? Who defines it? But I think it's also important to acknowledge that big events change how we look at violent extremism here in the United States. Is the threat foreign or domestic? If you look at history of how we've kind of gone, let's say from the 1960s and 70s to today. So we had these big airline hijackings that were taking place across Europe, the United States, the Middle East, and we were kind of looking at more foreign threats. Events like the Oklahoma City bombings brought things back to domestic. 9/11, again, pivoted policy and research and funding on violent extremism to look at foreign issues. And again, January 6th, once again, pivoted things more domestically. And this is really important to think about. When we talk about violent extremism, we need to think about where are we looking? Who is the violent extremist? How are we defining this? And that's kind of my starting point. I will say that where we are today, and I hate this term, but it's also the only way we could talk about it, is we're facing a fractured threat. Violent Islamist groups, which has predominantly dominated how we talk about violent extremism research over the last 20 years since 9/11, is become more diverse. It's different. We have Al-Qaeda, we have Islamic State, we have other groups like ISIS, like Hamas or Hezbollah that have more domestic policy stuff. But also ISIS and Al-Qaeda have become more fractured. We have affiliate organizations. We have groups that are more local who are pledging allegiance to these groups. And so that has become more fractured. But also domestically, and domestic violent extremist ideologies have become more diverse. We have REMV, so racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism. We have anti-government, animal rights, environmental, anti-abortion. And these groups have also become more fractured. And we see kind of a bit of a flow between these groups, and we'll talk about that as well. So why should we study women? And I kind of alluded to this in the beginning of the talk, is that extremism is not gender neutral, but often we aren't seeing women. They're not necessarily the most visible when we're talking about extremist groups. Often when you think of terrorism, you think of a man holding a gun, fighting on the front lines. And a lot of this has to do with imagery. And we'll kind of talk about why imagery often focuses on men, not women. And part of that has to do with more what I would call conservative or traditional gender roles that many groups encourage among their participants. And so if men are part of the outward facing, that's what we're seeing, but that doesn't diminish the roles that women are playing in these organizations and these vital roles, and we'll discuss a bit about those. I will say part of the interest and the discussion that has allowed us to talk about women and violent extremism a bit more has been due to either women's roles within combat movements or as combatants, so women suicide bombers, women as fighters, as part of FARC or other organizations like that, but also the rise of the internet. It allowed women to necessarily adhere to traditional gender roles that asked them to be in the private space, but allowed them to have a voice in the public sphere without actually physically entering the public sphere. And so we started to see women take on greater roles on the internet, and it allowed us to kind of engage with this kind of body a bit more. We've also had an increased understanding of women's roles. And if you'll notice, I underscored and bolded roles. One of my least favorite things is when people say, what is the role of women? Women don't have one role. We have many roles. There's so many things that we do. And it's just like saying, what is the role of men? It's not one role, it's roles, it's plural. It's how people are engaged in so many different aspects. And we really, really understand that more. It used to be, and I really hate this, it's the victim perpetrator dichotomy is what we used to call it. Women were either radical feminists who were out there fighting the good fight for equality, or they were pure victims. And we've kind of come to understand that very few women fit into one side or the other of that. And there's a bit of in between. So you can have agency when joining organization, and we'll talk about agency in a second, I promise. But you can have that ability to choose to join an organization, but once you join, you might lose some of that, free will and ability to make choices if the roles within that group might be more gender restrictive. And so it's really important to understand the diverse roles that women play. And finally, there's an increased understanding of gender dynamics within radicalization, within membership, and within de-radicalization. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. And that's not just in regard to women, it's also in regards to basically men, women, and their dynamics together. So I've thrown around the word gender a lot. I'm not a scientist, but I will very briefly say that sex is biological, it's male and female, and gender is a social construct. So gender basically means the relations between and among the sexes and their relative roles. It encompasses economic, political, and sociocultural attributes, constraints and opportunities associated with being male or female. And it definitely varies across cultures, and dynamics are open to change. And when we talk about these social contracts that affect day-to-day life, other very important ones are race, class, poverty level, ethnic group, and age. So is gender only about women? And I think it's important to remember that while gender is often talked about when we say women, and we talked about the evolution of this research. And I think the first part is about 15 years ago when I began, we were kind of saying, where are the women? And that was the first time we started to use the word gender to talk about women. And unfortunately, the research has kind of gotten stuck in that. And so people say gender, and the automatic assumption is women, but it's not. And this has really started to change. And there's some really great research out there about masculinity, hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, and what that means for these dynamics between men and women within groups. And so it is ever evolving, but you will hear people use gender and their first assumption will be women. And I think I'm always learning and I'm always reading, and I'm never, I joked around that we all have imposter syndrome because we keep learning every single day. We keep trying to answer more and more questions. And while researching a new paper, I was rereading The Doubled Vision of Feminist Theory by Joan Kelly. And I think it really resonated with me when she said, to use men's experiences as the sole category of analysis distorts the experiences of both men and women. And I think that really puts it well, because often when I say, where are the women, why are we not talking about the women? People assume that that only matters because I care about the women. But what it really does is we're hurting real discussions about men within these groups as well. So what is a gender analysis? A gender analysis is the systematic gathering and analysis of information of gender differences and social relations to identify and understand the different roles, division of labor, resources, constraints, needs, opportunities, capacity, and interests of men and women and boys and girls in a given context. It's a very official definition. What does that really mean? Let's delve into this a bit. Without gender research, so Phoebe Donnelly wrote this amazing piece for USIP, Resolve. I highly recommend everyone read it. But what she really said is, without gender research, it'd be difficult to make sense of the composition of violent extremist organizations, how they're able to recruit, retain members, why they choose different forms of violence, and what happens when they gain or lose territory. Because what gender does is it allows us, and using a gender analysis, allows us to understand decision-making and the dynamics within these groups. If you're only looking at men, or you're only looking at women, you're missing the intersection between these two and the dynamics that allow for certain changes to happen. And I think a really interesting case study is to look at women of the KKK. And Kathleen Blee did a really great analysis, and she kind of was the first person to go in and really look at this with a gendered lens. And, you know, she said that many historians have been looking at this and the activities of the Klanswomen and the Klansmen, and they said that the actions of Klanswomen were just incidental to the movement, and that they really were just a mere cultural screen behind which the men did the real work. And she argues that without a gendered lens, when we include the less public actions of the Klanswomen, the poison squads that spread rumors or slander, organized consumer boycotts, the picture actually changes. What we learn is that the Klanswomen acted in different ways that were complement to those of the Klansmen, making the Klan's influence both more extensive and more deadly than the actions of the Klansmen alone. So we can understand why the movement was so deadly in their peak in the 1920s because of the support and the action of the women involved as well. And I think that's really important to understand and kind of talk about, because sometimes people say, well, what are the women doing in these movements? What are their roles? But these roles are really vital. Now, part of my research and my evolution as a researcher has gone into kind of different aspects of understanding gender, men, women, and kind of involvement within violent extremism. And for me, one of the most interesting questions, and I think one that is ignored, is sometimes researchers will only focus on individuals, or they're only going to focus on organizations. And it's actually important to kind of interconnect the two and understand how they interact, sometimes complementary and sometimes in clash with one another. So men and women both have political and personal motivations for joining violent extremism. Organizations also have strategic motivations that they have. And sometimes the motivations of men and women and the organizations in which they participate differ. And that's really important to know, because when they differ, what happens? And we can see actual change. We see the actions of individuals can change the strategic decision-making of organizations. So let's talk about women's motivations. Sorry, there's a lot of words on this one. So I mentioned agency before, and so let me define that for you. So agency is an individual or a group's ability to make effective choices and transform those choices into desired outcomes. And when we talk about motivations of both men and women, I mentioned men and women both have personal and political motivations. Historically, unfortunately, when we talked about women's participation, it's often been focused on personal motivations, or it's been viewed in what we call gendered terms. So we say, a lot of research has said things like women were brainwashed, or they only joined a violent extremist movement to become a jihadi bride. If I can teach anything today, it's never use the term jihadi bride, please, please. To diminish a decision purely based on becoming a bride really just absolutely takes out all the other parts of that decision and political motivations involved as well. It only looks at the personal. But we're also guilty of this for men, right? If we only look at the political motivations of men, we're missing out on certain social or personal motivations that might be driving factors as well. And that's also very important for the de-radicalization or the disengagement process, to understand what was the both personal and political motivations of men and women. And in the radicalization process, a lot of research has discussed, is women's radicalization the same? Is it different? How does that compare among different men and women and the genders? And what kind of the consensus we kind of reached today is that there are similar pathways that men and women go through to radicalize, but men and women's experiences in these pathways differ based on their gender. It also differs based on race, it also differs based on class, it differs based on socioeconomic, where they're coming from, origin, etc. So these are all factors that come at play, and they play into how they radicalize too. So a woman, while radicalizing or while being recruited by an organization, might have certain gendered tropes thrown at her, such as the jihadi bride trope. It's not the sole thing that comes at her, but it is definitely part of that radicalization process. But for men, there's also gendered tropes thrown at them. You are a man, you must protect the women. You got to go protect women and children. And we'll see this across different ideologies as well. And it's this idea of the man as a protector. And so it's important to understand these gender dynamics in this process of radicalization. Unfortunately, a lot of the literature has neglected women and gender within this process. But like I said, it's really important to understand that women have had a long history within violent extremist movements among the left, among the right, far left, far right, and violent Islamist groups as well. And we'll delve a little bit into that. Now, we talked a bit about personal and political motivations of individuals, but what are organizations interested in? Why would an organization decide to incorporate women within their movement? So first of all is the ideology of the group. So typically far left groups have ideas of gender equality built into the ideology of the organization. And so you're more likely to see women in leadership roles or women as combatants within these movements because that adheres to the ideology of these movements. But other groups adhere to more traditional gender roles, men in public spaces, women in private, women as wives, mothers. And so why would a group like that seek to incorporate women into their organization? I do think that a lot of times when we talk about organizational motivations, we're talking about combat. And it's also very important to move beyond combat. Combat is definitely one of these roles that women play, but it's not the sole role that they play in these organizations. And it's really vital to kind of look beyond the role of combatant to think about the strategic decision-making of incorporating women. And when you talk about that, a lot of times it is very much strategic. It's women's utility, usefulness to the organization that they are thinking about. And that useful could be combatants. Women don't adhere to traditional security profiles. Not only that, but their attacks are more likely to gain more media attention for a cause. They also play into kind of more gender dynamics. We talked about how men need to feel as protector, but women's acts as combatants can also shame men into action. How can you men sit on the sidelines when women who have no need to go and be combatants are out there fighting your cause? And they can use that to play into these gender dynamics and shame men into action. But women's roles actually really come into play. And when we talk about stabilizing an organization, so if a group transitions into governance, how women's support can help to stabilize the group, add legitimacy to their cause. And that's kind of where my research has evolved a little bit too. And an interest that I've had is kind of looking at governance and what happens when you no longer have people who are members, but who are constituents, subjects who are under you. How do you kind of pass on that ideology, stabilize, add legitimacy to your cause as you move forward? And I think that it's really vital to say that these decisions change over time. They can change because of the institutional environment, so other groups that these terrorist actors are competing against. It could change because of the institutional environment because of who is acting against them, so state actors who are acting against them, but it can also change because of individuals' actions. I don't necessarily think I have a case study on this in this slide, but one of the best examples is if you talk about Hamas's decision to use female combatants or female suicide bombers in the Second Intifada, where the group was extremely reluctant to do that over a long period of time and talked about why they were reluctant. And basically, not only did the strategic environment change where other actors were using female suicide bombers, but they were facing a lot of strategic constraints. And the decision to finally implement the female suicide bombers came about due to women volunteering for these positions. And so this is also really important to remember that the actions of women can change how an organization perceives this over time. And just to kind of leave off with this is, again, organizations and individuals are in this institutional environment. Nobody's acting alone. Organizations influence other organizations, individuals influence and come together. So why is it important to look at women in violent extremism? I hope I've told you a few reasons, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are still very many misconceptions that we face today. That idea of that radical feminist or that weak victim very much comes into play when we're talking about disengagement, de-radicalization, or even punishment for actions. So unfortunately, a lot of CVE and countering violent extremism over the years has kind of simplified women's roles. Some programs have underestimated women. Others have kind of overestimated women. We call it the add women and stir. So either adding too much responsibility to women, right? Women aren't necessarily in charge of their whole families, but some CVE programs have kind of said, well, mothers should be in charge of stopping their children from joining terrorist organizations, which in theory is great, but shouldn't the whole family be involved? Why just mothers? And what does that mean when you only put mothers in charge? And how does that break down family structures? So there's really a need for a nuanced understanding of these kind of what are women's roles within these movements, and also what are women's roles within CVE. It's very important to have women in the room when you're making these decisions, because otherwise there's just going to be a lack of understanding. And it's important to have diversity in the room when you're making these decisions. Otherwise there's going to be a lack of understanding. Audrey Alexander and Rebecca Turkington did a really great article for the Counterterrorism Center Sentinel, CTC Sentinel, which I highly recommend you all look at. And they basically looked at comparing men and women in the United States. How are they likely to be charged and arrested for terrorism-related crimes? And what they found is that women are less likely to be arrested and convicted. And if they are convicted, they're more likely to receive more lenient sentences. So we do understand that women are underestimated still. And we're actually kind of trying to track this now with the January 6th events as well. So men and women, first of all, more men were arrested than women, partially because there were a lot of men there, but a lot of women who were there weren't necessarily arrested. But also trying to track kind of this idea of what crimes are they being charged with, and if they're being charged with the same crime, what are the sentencing that we're going to see? And we're still seeing these gender roles come into not just how we talk about and engage with women who participate, so not just the prosecution, but also the defense. We're seeing a lot of cases in which the defense argues, but she was a wife, she was a mother, she's a grandmother, she's a good community engager, and this is why she shouldn't go to prison, right? So gender stereotypes go on both sides.